And yet I ask you, is not an alien force already among us?
Hello, welcome back to Against the Grain. Thanks for joining me. So with the recent exploration I've been carrying out with regards to the telepathy tapes, what's obviously apparent is this connection between mainstream materialistic science and data which is seriously amassing to question that. And despite all of that, really the goal of the podcast and the goal of the upcoming documentary of the telepathy tapes was to raise money so that legitimate empirical science can be carried out to verify what now increasingly larger and larger numbers of people are already saying exists. So I find that interesting. I find it interesting that we have to get validation from the mainstream paradigm, which most people now are questioning seriously anyway. There's this breaking down of follow the science. I think probably the pandemic recently has made lots of people question whether things were done in the interest of science, whether or not it was done for financial reasons, etc. So it's strange that historically these things are coming about at the same time, that whilst there's a big questioning of religion, of mysticism, of paranormal, of all things to do with what mainstream science would not agree with, we come up against the telepathy tapes. Now, despite all of that, these tests still have to be carried out. It's still progressing in this fashion where funds are being raised, tests are being carried out. And in the trailer for the telepathy tapes, you'll see a scientist, a Dr. Jeff Tarrant, who's my guest this evening, carrying out kind of brain scans. He puts this equipment on the children's or adults' heads, the autistic, non-verbal autistic individuals' heads, and, carries out all sorts of tests and checks out their brainwaves, what parts of their brains are operating whilst these seemingly paranormal telepathic events are taking place. So I thought it'd be good to get him on because I've watched a few of his podcasts. I've picked up a copy of his book, Jeff Tarrant, PhD, Becoming Psychic, Learning Lessons from the Minds of Mediums, Healers and Psychics. Now, in the podcast I've watched of Jeff, he's definitely gone through one of those flip type experiences where, he was a fully paid up skeptic, subscribed to Skeptics magazine, and then had some experience which made him say, okay, maybe things aren't the way I thought they were, which is, the subject of one of my favourite authors, Jeffrey Kripal, the title of his book, The Flip. And it's about this flip. So we are progressing forward, the telepathy tapes are progressing forward to bring about empirical evidence so that we can present that to the general public and say, look, the paradigm isn't what we thought it was. We're gonna flip. We want them all to flip with evidence that is irrefutable. And part of that evidence is this mapping of the brain work that Jeff Tarrant has done. So Jeff's a fascinating figure in the field of psychology and neurofeedback. He's got a PhD and board certified in neurofeedback, which involves using real-time displays of brain activity to teach self-regulation of brain function. His journey from mainstream science to exploring psychic phenomena reflects a blend of rigorous scientific methods with an openness to alternative experiences, which for me echoes what Jeffrey Kripal always says, which is, we must listen to the experiencers. So let me get straight into it and welcome tonight's guest, Dr. Jeff Tarrant. Oh, and as always, please do me a favour, hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. Helps me reach more people, blah, blah, blah. Thank you very much. Hi, Jeff. Thanks so much for joining me.
Hey, Gary. Appreciate you having me on.
It's an absolute pleasure. I picked up a copy of your book recently. I must have confessed I've flicked through it, and I've watched a few of your podcasts that you've given interviews on, and I actually had a conversation with ChatGPT earlier about your work and some of your goals. And obviously I've seen you on the trailer for the telepathy tapes. And as you know, I've been interviewing some of the mums, and I had Diane on recently. So in my introduction, I talked about the fact that we're at this stage where, the whole discussion is around materialistic science and the paradigm that we're currently in, and how this sort of work is seen as fringe and rejected, and the weight of evidence that seems necessary in order to convince, the naysayers, as it were, is hefty, let's say. And you talk. I watched a podcast of you earlier. I've forgotten who it was with. Sorry, but a nice guy, wears a suit and a tie. Interview, give you a really sort of smart interview.
Well, maybe Tim.
Tim, is it? Okay.
Yeah.
And you talked about this fact that you were a fully paid up member of the Skeptic, and that you were in that camp yourself, and then something happened to you, and that coincides with one of my sort of heroes, Jeffrey Kripal, in his book, The Flip. So tell me about your flip. What made you flip?
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess I'm a flip-flopper because as a child, I was totally into all the weird stuff. Bigfoot, UFOs, aliens, psychokinesis. I just thought it was great. I wasn't trying to do any of it. I just enjoyed science fiction and exploring those kinds of fun ideas. And really, that stayed fairly consistent until really I attribute my change to being in graduate school as a psychologist. And somewhere in that training, became convinced that all of this stuff is just wishful thinking. It's fantasy, maybe even defense mechanisms as a way to kind of make ourselves feel special, or, to avoid certain things, or sort of an escape fantasy or something like that. And so became pretty convinced that all of this was silly, and, became kind of a hardcore skeptic for a while. And then, really, I think it was probably when I started exploring for myself things like meditation and Qigong and yoga. And, at the time when I got into it, I wasn't even sure what I was drawn to necessarily. But once I started really practicing those things, I think started kind of opening my mind that, like, wait a minute, I think there's maybe more going on here than just can be explained by materialistic science. And, like being able to feel energy, things like that, that it's kind of like,
So, was it with the Qigong that you began to feel that, or was it the meditation, or was it a combination of both? And how did you first feel the energy as you describe it?
Yeah, Qigong was really what kind of led me in that path of feeling energy. And, of course, they refer to it as Qi. And, I think it had something to do with my first teacher. At the time, I was living in the middle of nowhere, Missouri, and this is many years ago. And so it wasn't like there was a lot of this stuff around. And I happened to find this little group that was practicing every Sunday and joined them. And the teacher was combining a lot of things. I didn't know it at the time, but he was combining shamanic stuff and energy healing stuff and Qigong. And so for me, it was all Qigong. I didn't know the difference. But so there was a strong emphasis on sort of using the energy that we were cultivating for healing purposes and that sort of thing. And so, it wasn't too far down the road that, I could start feeling things. I could feel energy moving in my body. I could feel energy between my hands. I could feel energy if somebody was directing it toward me. If I was directing it toward them, they would recognize that. So, to me, these kinds of experiences, it was like, okay, wait a minute. Something's going on here besides, and just my own experiences, something besides placebo, something besides wishful thinking. And, and at the same time, I was doing a lot of work with EEG technologies, really more of a clinical practice of looking at using brain imaging for mental health and, kind of in the field of neurofeedback. And so I had this equipment where I could measure the brain. And so started combining these things. Oh, I wonder what's going on in the brain when somebody's meditating or when somebody's, doing these various things. And that's where it stayed for a pretty long time, was kind of in that realm. And then I was working at the University of Missouri, and a student of mine introduced me to his mom, who he told a crazy story about her and how after she was a psychic medium, and after doing a holotropic breathwork experience, she started channeling these shamanic languages. And so he tells me this story and basically says, "Do you want to map her brain?" And I was like, "Sure." I was still pretty skeptical. I was like, "This story sounds nuts. This just sounds absolutely bonkers." But it's like, why not, right? Like, sure. I was kind of into different states of consciousness, and so it was like, yeah, let's look at it. And so I was really kind of meeting Janet. Her name is Janet Mayer, and working with her over the course of several years, and seeing what she did and hearing her story and looking at the brain imaging, that all of a sudden I was like, oh, okay. And all of my interests and from childhood came back, and I was like, okay, let's look at this. And so, one thing leads to another, as they say. And then over the last 12 years, I've, I don't know how many mediums and psychics and healers I've measured their brainwave activity. And, after seeing enough things, it's pretty hard to deny. And so now I'm completely on the other side of the fence now. I'm no longer a skeptic. I shouldn't say that. I'm still skeptical, but I'm not, but I also believe these things are real. They're not always consistent. They're not always mind-blowing, but they're real. And so now my interest is trying to understand, how does this work, right? So, if some people are able to do this, how? And, can we use that information for the rest of us who are mediocre at best to, develop our own abilities, if that's something we're interested in?
Yes. I mean, the word skeptic, we get it a lot in the crop circle research that I've been carrying out, obviously. And I think, unfortunately, like many words, they get twisted and warped in a lot of the general population's mind. And so people think of that as being a wise thing to do, because then you're not gullible and taken in. But it also seems to imply that you need to play devil's advocate. And it sort of opens the door to a form of willful blindness to data. Would you agree?
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring up this definition issue, because I would say most of the people that identify as skeptics now, they're not really open to other information. They really have a belief system. So it's not really that they're skeptical. They have a belief system that none of this is real, and they're going to do everything they can to prove that point. And to me, being skeptical is really kind of what you said initially, right? It's like, well, yeah, it makes sense to, look at things and go like, well, is there another explanation? Is there something else that could explain this? I don't want to be gullible, but also being open-minded, that if the evidence is strong enough, then it's like, well, then you have to accept that. Then you have to accept that this is what's actually happening.
But it seems to me like the telepathy tapes, right? You've got Dr. Powell, who began her research, I believe, with this particular area, with savants, and I love discovering that means to know. It's just so perfect, isn't it? But then you've got this issue where, for a long time it's accepted that these people can have these abilities without being taught them. Now that opens up a world of possibilities about consciousness and psychology and all the rest of it, right? And yet, as Jeffrey Kripal says, what the materialists do is they take that off the table. So it's not on the table. They can't answer it. So it doesn't form part of what's on the table to discuss about the current paradigm. So they explain the paradigm based on what they put on the table. And when we put other stuff on the table, there's a kind of fundamentalist jiggery pokery that goes on, right? That gets it off the bloody table. It's true, isn't it?
It's very true. I mean, it kind of reminds me a little bit of, medical doctors, when, they diagnose something and say, oh, you're going to die in a year. and the person heals themselves.
Right.
And they come back in, and the doctor's like, well, I don't know what to tell you. That doesn't make any sense. So we're just going to put it aside and ignore it, right? And it's like, it's an anomaly. And it's like, well, okay,
Yeah, an anomaly. We had a BBC, which, was the authority and the bastion of truth throughout the world, a documentary with some scientist. She was a medical doctor, I believe, a Professor Kathy something or the other, who went around, it was some years ago, it was like late 90s, early 2000s when the sort of, the new age sort of the resurgence of meditation and acupuncture and these kind of, stuff from the East was coming around. So the BBC thought we better get some scientists in there and have a look at it. So she went around and there was a part where somebody was having open heart surgery, but they didn't have any anesthetic. They just had acupuncture needles, right? And there's this person who's awake and conscious and not looking at what's going on here, right? But it's open. And I'll never forget, this woman looked at it and she said, and it was there happening in front of her, and she was talking to the woman and she went, I need more data. I can't accept this. I just need more data. So, that's it, isn't it? That's that confrontation with the flip moment.
Well, and, you've brought up the telepathy tapes a couple of times, and that seems to be what a lot of the materialists are doing with that, right? They'll kind of zone in on one little element. So I see so many of them commenting on facilitated communication as being, like, oh, that's been debunked and whatever, and so this can't be real. But, I mean, in my mind, it's like, okay, let's even just assume that that's true. But there's numerous examples that have been given in the telepathy tapes where nobody's touching them at all. They're typing independently. There's no facilitated communication. They're in a completely separate room. And so it's like, well, okay, wait a minute. Like you're getting hyper focused on this thing that's actually not an issue. It's not, it's an important part of the story of the telepathy tapes, but it doesn't really have anything to do with the telepathy.
Well, this is it. But what you see, and I've seen this many times in many fields of these kinds of areas, where that focusing in on those couple of points then gets amplified, like in a Goebbels type propaganda. It gets spread everywhere, and then people just kind of adopt that into the natural response, which excludes all of the other data, which, if laid out and presented in a reasonable way, would just make that as oh God, that does, let's get that over there because that's nonsense. But it doesn't, and typically you see this over and over again with these kinds of subjects where, the sophistication. I worked in I went to university and studied language and communication, so you get to know how propaganda and how things can get into the minds of people to a certain extent, and I'm interested in that as well. But you see this filter through into society, and this natural knee-jerk response comes out of people, which they've kind of been programmed to say in a way, and it becomes fundamentalist, doesn't it?
Yeah, and then you're kind of missing the point. Like you're, I've got a good friend of mine, colleague that, we're working on some additional telepathy research programs. And we've talked about this numerous times because he's listened to all of these, podcasts and blogs who are kind of arguing against this. And it just makes him crazy because he's like, this makes no sense. Like they're not following the logic, which is actually what they think they're doing. And somehow they've gotten off track. And so, that fundamentalist, it's like, this is impossible. There's no way this can be true. And that's it. That's the premise. And so, then you have to find reasons to support that proposition. And go ahead.
Well, sorry. So you just made me immediately think of this issue of, because there's this issue with the crop circles, you see, where just enough, there's an abundance of mystery. And on the one hand, if I've made a film about it, which compares people who've made crop circles, and it times them, and it looks at the quality of what they've done and how long they took to plan it and what was their end result. And then it compares that to huge, quite elaborate crop circles, which we know appeared in sort of 4 or 5 hours of darkness. And it's very dark in these areas. And you say, okay, and it's on uneven land. And there's all these different things that pile up that say, We should seriously question this man-made explanation, because to execute something like that, you can speak to engineers and land surveyors and people that are experts in the field and say, how would you go about something like that? And they go, phew. And so I made a film that compares actually people doing this and making it compared to these ones that are genuinely mysterious in terms of that sort of time frame. And you get the same thing. You get the same kind of responses to, how people will ignore that kind of evidence. But I've kind of lost my point now on what we was going to say with the telepathy. Oh yeah, the whole thing with the telepathy and the crop circles themselves is that there's enough doubt sometimes with even the genuine ones, which seems to give people a way out. Jeffrey Kripal said there was this incident with a UFO, an alien. Some guy was driving on the highway. I can't remember the whole story. An alien presents itself to him and says, "We want you to believe in us, but not too much." Right. And so, I began to because these skeptics, when you watch them with the crop circles, they used to drive me mad. We all went through this process, and then we kind of come out the other side of it and thought, okay, that kind of fundamentalism, not skepticism, is necessary because only people can only contrast themselves after the flip to that mindset and see where they were and have some kind of compassion and forgiveness for those people. Do you think that's right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it's right, but I think it makes sense. And, for me, I'm trying to kind of change my own attitude around the research that I'm doing, because I know that no matter what I do and no matter how airtight it is, it's not going to matter to that group. Like, it doesn't matter what I do. And so on that level, it's like, well, maybe that's not who I'm talking to, right? That's not my audience, because they're not going to believe any of it, regardless. And so, for me, that actually relaxes some of the burden a little bit, of just going like, forget that group, right? Because it's impossible. It's an impossible task. And so instead, it's like, can we present enough data, hard data, so that the people who are truly skeptical, not rigid, fundamental, but truly skeptical, where they're going like, because I've seen those people too on podcasts and blogs who said, man, this is really compelling, but gosh, I'd like to see more data. And
that's fair, isn't it? That's fair, isn't it?
That's totally fair.
What's wrong with that?
Nothing. In fact, I think that's smart, right? Like,
yes.
If I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, I'd probably be doing the same thing.
Absolutely.
I'd be going like, okay, this is cool, but I want to see more,
right.
And so I think that's the audience that we want to talk to, right? Is that it's kind of like, hey, look, okay, here, let me give you some more compelling evidence, so that people can really see what's going on and understand it. Because, honestly, I think it's, Kai says this all the time, that this is sort of a paradigm shift. And I've even felt that for myself, even though I've seen a lot of interesting, weird things, seeing what some of these non-speakers can do, it really changes your whole perspective. It's like, oh, wow. Okay. When they're getting 100% correct,
100%.
100%. Well, and it's not even just that it's 100%, but it's 100% on an open response task, right? It's like, here's a word. It could be any word. That's very different than most of the telepathy research in the past, where it's like, it's a forced choice. Here's 4 choices.
Yeah.
One of them is
circle,
correct.
Triangle, cross.
Exactly. And even then, like most research, even with that old school telepathy experiments, they're getting 30, 35% when they should be getting 20, 25%.
Right.
And it's statistically significant. It's interesting.
Yeah.
But 100% on an open response, what do you do with that? Right.
Right. It is paradigm change. And I like the bit in the podcast where Kai talks about the flip of the cameraman when she walks in on him and he says, do I have to believe in God now? Because he's gone there. It seems like from that, the way she describes it, that he's gone there with that mindset of like, this can't be real. Just I don't care. It's just a camera gig, right? I'm just gonna. But and then you get the flip like that. That can be quite traumatic, and it can be quite. I think that's why that we all sort of came to the conclusion in the crop circle arena that there needs to be a way out, because it can be a bit too much to handle to have your world shaken like that.
Yeah.
So do you know what I mean? Gently,
yeah.
sort of. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And I can totally see that. For me, it was it didn't have that effect because I was already, I was a big fan of the X-Files. I want to believe, right? I've always kind of, not always,
it's on the wall here.
Yeah, perfect, right? It's like, since I started doing this work, that's always kind of been where I've sat. It's just like, man, I really want this to be true, but it's like, there's still a lot of doubt, and there's still, a lot of things that I've seen that aren't terribly convincing, and and so then when it's like, oh, this proves it, right? It'd be like if you want to, you're investigating crop circles and you see one happen, right? It's like, oh, okay.
Well, that is what happened to me. I don't know if you know that story. Yeah. That's so on. Yeah, I don't know if you know the story. I'm not going to go into it all now. You can check it, but yeah. So I went onto a hill on 7th of July 2007 with my girlfriend and a cameraman, and we started filming this field. And after a flash of light, there was a 1,000-foot crop circle with 150 circles in the field in front of us.
Whoa.
So and so then the following year, everybody said, well, you're going to do another night watch on 888 because of the date, right? So I said, yeah, sure. So about 200 people came up this hill. And in the morning, there was this complex figure of 8 on uneven land that wasn't there the night before, that at 4:30 a.m. was there. So 2 years running, I had these cosmic experiences of being, with 2 other people on the first occasion and 200 other people on the second occasion when a crop circle appeared. And nobody saw anything happen apart from what we saw, a flash of light when I saw that. But yeah, so these things do happen, and they don't get they get the same amount of attacks and sort of, the materials. And that's the point I want to make, is that it seems that the gatekeepers, the people who can finally put the stamp on and go, okay, this is real then, are these hard skeptics, are these hard fundamentalists. And so, universities being born out of, Christian churches and religious traditions and those kinds of things, like Oxford University and so on. Do you think there's still some element of, the demons and the angels and the possessed and the animism and the primitive? Do you think that's part of it? Still the legacy of it?
It's a good question. I mean, certainly I think there are segments of the population where that's still a huge component. And, you've talked to some of the parents of these kids, and some of them wrestled with this at the beginning, right? If they had, really fundamental beliefs, Christian beliefs, and many of them still do, but they had to then reconcile that, right? Because, in their mind, it's like, oh, anything psychic or anything in that realm is from the devil.
Work of the devil, yeah.
Work of the devil. And so that's like, well, wait a minute, now your kid's doing it. Right? And it's like, and clearly they're not from the devil.
They're
right?
good people.
They're great, In fact, most of what they talk about or spell about is messages of love and connection. And so it's like, okay, so then you have to reconcile that, right? And you have to kind of like, how do you figure that out? But yeah, it makes sense that there's still large pockets of the population where that's the way it's going to be interpreted. And so certainly we have to wrestle with that. But I think even maybe more so, especially with the universities, just that really rigid materialistic view that is going to prevent any investigation. In fact, since I got involved with the telepathy tapes, I've had at least 3 or 4 scientists contact me by email and with curious questions, ideas, things, but they don't want to do it themselves. They don't want their name on anything. And probably for good reason, they could, lose their position, lose, funding. And so, it makes sense. And I do feel like things are becoming a little bit more open, but there's still, those gatekeepers that make it difficult. In fact, I've been thinking about, once I do have more data to get it published, and it's like, well, what journal is going to even look at this, right? It's like probably only the ones that do weird stuff. You try to put it in a mainstream journal, and I mean, I might try it. We'll see, but it's just really hard to imagine.
I know. We tried to get there's a lot of scientific research we wanted to do on the crop circles, and we had a biophysicist called W.C. Levengood, who did a lot of soil and plant analysis for us, and there's different labs that they got in the United States that we'd sent samples off to. But, obviously the same stigma was attached, that anybody that got involved in it was going to affect their reputation. And so that's how powerful and insidious that kind of censorship is. We know, Professor John Mack, who got involved, as in the abductions and the psychology of people, that was, they tried to get him removed from tenure, as or what happened to Diane. So it's a serious business, and we understand why people. Gary Nolan, who's I don't know if you know Dr. Gary Nolan from Stanford, yeah,
I don't know him personally, but I know who he is. Yeah,
I don't know him personally, but he's obviously doing the rounds and has been for a while now. But this issue with one thing he said to Tucker Carlson in an interview was that ever since he's sort of come out, as it were, in terms of like, this is what the CIA come and asked me to do, and we found this, that, and the other, affected their brains and so on. That when he goes to conferences now, everybody wants to have dinner with him, and afterwards they want to sort of like, so tell us about this, and they're all really interested, but don't want to be. But he said there are whole areas of researchers now in propulsion and engineering and and all sorts of stuff that are being researched and or triggered to do research in these sorts of fields, which is kind of weird as well, because then there's a whole scientific or wave of scientific people, that mainstream scientific people, that are involved in doing something which they can't really talk about. And isn't it a weird time like that?
It's a very weird time. And it's interesting because there are a few programs connected, like the program that Gary's involved in, and University of Virginia, their program, and there's a few of these places that exist. Princeton used to have the Pear Lab, where somehow they've kind of snuck this in, and they've been able to get away with it, and it's been okay. But that's the rarity, right? Like, I just named 3 places, and I think that's it. I think that's the 3,
right.
In any sort of major university.
Interesting. Okay, so altered states of consciousness. Now, when I started this journey, it was weird, actually. I'd had a bit of a nervous breakdown. I used to work in law and had a bit of a nervous breakdown, took some time out, started doing yoga, meditation, did loads of martial arts when I was young. So I started doing judo when I was 5, got involved in an Indonesian martial art when I was like 16, and we did everything with chi, where they hit us with bricks, and it was all about mind and meditation, and we used to feel energy from each other across the room, similar to what you described earlier, right? I was doing this sort of stuff when I was 16. Got married at 20, didn't do anything for 10 years, had a bit of a nervous breakdown, then got back into Tai Chi and yoga and stuff. And as a result of that, the world had changed a bit. I was reading books on Qigong and going, hang on, this Qigong is what I used to do in Kateda and all that sort of stuff, and going out and finding out stuff in the world. And one of the books I read was Carlos Castaneda, and that kind of had a whole triggering of effects on me. It ended up meeting a teacher who became a mentor of mine for 10 years, who was a peyote shaman over from the States. And so my first experience I had acid and stuff when I was 17 and had different, smoked weed and stuff. But, when you eat peyote, that's a whole different ballgame. And it's not for sissies.
No. No, it's not.
And so, there's life before peyote and life after peyote. And I understand why Ginsberg wrote How now, So tell me about your work with regards to that, because I've looked at your website, or I've looked at some of the links that you've got with the Neurolink and these sorts of things. Can you talk to me about that?
Yeah. So, altered states, where to start? There's so many different directions to go. So let me start off by talking about it from sort of a psychological aspect, right? Because I'm a psychologist, right? So that's part of where I come from. But, we know very clearly that one of the things that seems to facilitate mental wellness is psychological flexibility. Very clear. The research is overwhelming. And one of the things that gets us in trouble is our minds being rigid. And in fact, even things like depression or anxiety, we can think of them as sort of repetitive patterns in our functioning that, they just keep doing it. It just keeps going over and over and over again, even though it's not helpful. And even though, so it's kind of a stuck pattern. And so, this idea that altered states of consciousness, essentially what it's doing is shifting you out of your normal perception, out of your normal way of thinking, out of your normal identity of how you see yourself and how you see yourself connected to the world. So, for me, there's kind of a twofold interest in these practices. One is this psychological aspect of the potential behind these things for improving our mental well-being. But then, of course, because of my other experiences with Qigong and meditation and whatever, that makes you interested as well in exploring, what else is out there in consciousness land that I haven't experienced before? And so, I've worked with various plant medicines, including peyote. So I understand. My first experience was actually with ayahuasca.
I lived in Mexico recently, and I did a very serious ayahuasca session before I left, so I know about that one too.
Yeah, that's also not for sissies.
Definitely not for sissies, no.
And so I've done a fair amount of that kind of medicine work. But then because so much of what I do involves technology, it's like, well, what other ways? And, those medicines are not for everybody. There's a lot of people that I work with, and, even for myself, like, I don't want to do them all the time.
No.
And so it's like, well, what other techniques, approaches can we use to also shift the brain into, more openness, more flexibility? And so using things like stroboscopic light and breath work, using even neurofeedback in specific ways, that there are certain patterns that we can encourage in the brain to help people find these spaces. And so for me, that's a huge area of interest, just for exploration, but also, mental wellness. But then the third area, because of some of what I've been doing lately, is like, can we also use some of these things to facilitate psi abilities?
Okay.
And I'm saying that kind of broadly, right? Because it could be telepathy, it could be spirit communication, it could be psychokinesis, whatever. But, because we've identified some patterns in the brain that are fairly consistent, it's like, well, can we reverse engineer this? Can we use the technology to kind of nudge the brain in the right direction? You still have to do something, right? I don't think the technology is just going to make you psychic all of a sudden.
Okay.
It might. Actually, what's interesting is that it seems like people that already have some sort of a proclivity for these things, if they use the tech, it just like launches them into it. So it's like they're already open, and then this just like pushes them over the edge. Right?
And have you found any neurological kind of pattern to that? Because Gary Nolan says there is this neurodivergence. He even goes as far as saying that neurodivergent people are seeking out neurodivergent mates and producing neurodivergent children. Have you found any patterns like that yourself?
No, but I haven't really looked at that.
Okay.
What I've been looking at is, and it took a while because I had to get enough data. Because what I've seen is that when you look at the brainwave patterns of people doing whatever it is, psychic work or mediumship or whatever, at least initially, when you look at that, and it's like, well, everybody's doing something different. What I wanted for my science brain wanted the brains are all doing the same thing.
Right.
Everybody's getting into the same brainwave state, and it's, and that wasn't what I was finding at all. And so it was sort of frustrating at first because it was like, well, but then once I got enough data, you start to see patterns. And so there's patterns, but then there's individual differences as well. And so, the brain waves themselves don't seem to be as predictive of what's going on as brain regions. There's certain parts of the brain that show up over and over and over and over again. And how people shift those brain regions, that's where it seems to vary. So we kind of know where we're looking. And then it's a little bit of an, experiment to say, well, let's try this in that brain region. What does that do? And it's kind of like, not much. Well, what if we do this? Oh, that's different. And it's like, okay. And so it's a little bit of, sort of helping people find which type of approach is going to unlock things for them, if that makes sense.
It does. Can you give me an example of like, so you've got different therapies. You said like, the light therapy that comes from these glasses, right? Where it's doing different stuff to try and induce theta waves or delta waves or whatever it is.
Yeah.
You've got something audible or audible, I should say. What else is there to get someone? And would you sort of equate these? Or there's different states if there's different brainwaves, but when they're performing these psi abilities, are they in a particular brainwave state, or does that vary as well?
Well, it does vary. It's interesting. In general, in general.
Well,
yeah. Let me take one step back.
Okay.
So there are a couple of brainwave patterns that are pretty consistent, and so one of them, for example, has to do with the occipital lobe, right? So the very back of the brain.
Right.
We think of it as mostly responsible for visual processing.
Mm-hmm.
And when I look at psychics, especially during a psychic reading, the back of the brain lights up, and it lights up particularly in the gamma frequency range. So, there may be other things that show up as well, but gamma seems to be the biggest and loudest of the bunch, and that's pretty consistent. So we see gamma, we see it in the back of the brain in certain circumstances pretty regularly.
Okay.
The other one that we see a lot is, this right kind of parietal lobe back here. There's a lot of interesting things going on back there. And there's a specific aspect of that part of the brain that is sometimes referred to as the God spot.
Okay. The God spot.
The God spot. Yeah. And that name actually came from, researchers that were studying actually what was going on with people with traumatic brain injuries. And so they studied a group of people that had injuries to that area and said, well, what can we learn about that part of the brain from people that have injuries there? And what they found was that, overwhelmingly after the injury, they became more empathic and reported more spiritual experiences. And so starting to look at, well, what's this part of the brain about? And it's really about creating boundaries. So when that part of the brain is doing its normal job, it's creating separation, saying, I'm Jeff, I live in this little meat suit. I'm separate from Gary. Gary lives in his little meat suit.
Okay.
We're all different. But if you disrupt that part of the brain, all of a sudden those boundaries are a little bit more flexible.
And whereabouts is that? Whereabouts is that in the brain, Jeff? Is it?
It's about kind of right back here, that the back right quadrant.
Back right quadrant. Okay.
And so what's interesting is I've seen that part of the brain go offline, especially with mediums, channelers, things like that, very regularly. So it's usually like excessive delta and theta, really slow brain waves, or sometimes it even looks like a seizure back there. The stuff's just off the chart, but it's only in that little spot. And they're clearly not having a seizure. They're sitting there having talking and,
Really?
Yeah. And so, somehow they figured out a way to get that part of the brain out of the way. And what I suspect is that that's how they connect, is it's like somehow they can shut that part down temporarily and then become more expansive. So just to pick on those two things, well, those are fairly specific. So we can use technology to focus on that region and try to induce delta and theta.
Okay.
All right. So whether it's with light and sound, or whether it's with like low power pulsed electromagnetic frequencies, or transcranial direct current stimulation, or even neurofeedback, because we could put a sensor right here and just reward people when their delta and theta increases back there. So again, that's kind of like learning how to do that yourself.
Well, in a sort of operant conditioning kind of way.
Exactly. Right.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's where I'm having fun right now.
Well, that's interesting, isn't it? Finding technological ways to hack the brain. But so if a psychic medium sort of so many things come to my mind when these things come up. I get my line of thought. Psychic mediums tend to suggest that they're contacting this other realm, that there's this place, this oneness, isn't there? It's like, what is it? Jeffrey Kripal calls it. Is it like a dual monad or something like that? A duality of I can't remember the exact phrase he uses, but you've got this individuality, you've got this oneness, and so I get this God spot that sort of switches off that bit that says this is an I and connects us to the whole in some way.
Yeah.
But then, but all the focus on the brain. Do you think that was there a point when you said, okay, it can't all be taking place in the brain? There's this field that the brain is outside of the body as well. Have you found any evidence of that in your, scientific testing that is the case?
Yeah. So, and actually, I think that God spot stuff that we just talked about is a good example of that. Is, we know that a lot of what the brain is doing is inhibiting. It's restricting the amount of information. It's a huge filter.
Right.
And actually, Aldous Huxley talked about this, years and years ago. He talked about the brain as a reducing valve, that, all this information comes in and then we only get this little tiny little piece. And there's lots of ways the brain does that. And so, I think what's going on most of the time is that you have to shut those inhibitory controls off. And that's how people get the information. And so what that suggests is like, well, you got to get the brain out of the way. It's not the brain that's creating these experiences. It's actually the brain that's stopping them.
Right.
And so somehow you got to shut the brain down in certain ways. I mean, you still need it, right?
Yeah.
So you can't shut everything down.
Yeah.
But it's like, there's certain parts that you can maneuver, right? Like, I'm going to activate this part and I'm going to shut this one down. And then this will allow me to kind of step into that space and still stay conscious, and, that is a little bit of a mystery, right? But so there's evidence with the God spot that that's the case. There's other research evidence. I just did a small study, but it was based on some research done by a guy named Friedman. And he used a kind of a high power RTMS device, so repetitive transcranial magnetic stimulation.
Right.
And they applied it to the left frontal lobe to shut it down. So they got specific ways that they can essentially, they call it like a temporary lesion.
Wow.
Right? So they essentially shut the left frontal lobe down. And when they did that, people performed better on a micropsychokinesis test of being able to manipulate things with their mental thought.
Really?
Yeah. By getting the left frontal lobe out of the way. You shut it down. And, of course, that's the analytic, language-oriented part of the brain. And, we did something similar, kind of replicating his study, but using low power. So instead of the big, huge, massive thing, and we got similar results. It was a little bit different, but people perform better when we, inhibited.
Switch off bits of the brain.
Switch off bits of the brain. Yeah.
Well. It's like the world's being turned upside down, isn't it? It's like, no, the brain's in the way now. We need to get that one. Isn't that funny? So flow state, remember Zizek Mihaly and the flow state and this notion of ecstasis, to stand beside yourself, which is a great description of an altered state of consciousness, I think, to stand beside yourself. But so I've been engaged in African drumming for a number of years, and polyrhythmic music and what that does to consciousness because of the irregularity of where you think your foot's going to come down on a beat and it doesn't come there because polyrhythm kind of plays around the numbers with 3s and 2s and stuff, and it's trippy on its own. If you do a psychedelic with that as well, that you've really got to hold on to white knuckle, right? As Terrence McKenna said, if you've got meditation as well and you do it on a full moon and when the constellation of whatever it is up in there, line it all up, take the psychedelic. That was Terrence McKenna's attitude to sort of brave man. So you got the flow, you got this flow state. Is there any connection between what Csikszentmihalyi would describe as going into this state of flow where he says the brain normally works as a sort of like listening to my voice now, you're processing about 60 bits of information. If you were to listen to 2 voices, it would be 120 bits, and our brain is only capable of processing 110. So that's why we can't listen to 2 people talking at once, right? But in the flow state, it seems like everything slows down and that we can process more of this information. Is that what we're talking about here as well with regards to some of the psychic stuff?
It may be similar in certain ways, because the other pattern that I haven't really talked about directly is, and this is one of the most consistent patterns, is that everything that changes in the brain with all of these different things, not everything, most of it is in the right hemisphere, and which is very interesting. And even when I talk to mediums that I know well, and they describe their process, many of them talk about that they don't even know what they're saying, right? That they're just kind of getting out of the way. And, so the right hemisphere is much more of a present moment, sensory, true experience. So you're just experiencing what is without labels, without language, without analysis, which is all that left brain stuff. And so for me, I think, maybe being in the right brain is much more of a flow state. The left brain we get in our heads. And if you're in your head, you're not in a flow state. It's impossible. In fact, there was a study done with golfers. This is related, I promise, sort of.
Oh, I go on. I'm good for this. Go on.
Okay. So, they took an amateur golfer, a pro-am golfer and a professional golfer. And they hooked their brains up and they had them come up and making putts. And what they found was that the amateur golfer and actually the pro-am golfer, the same thing, they'd come up, they're analyzing it, their left brain's involved, they're thinking, what's the wind doing, what's the slant, all the stuff and things. And then when they went to make the putt, their brain just kept going. The professional golfer, they came up, they're analyzing everything, but then once they get to the ball, it just shuts down. There's no more talking internally. They just make the putt, right? And so it's like, okay, to me, that's a huge difference, right? That it's like, yeah, you need to think, but then when you're done with that, you put it away and you just are in the experience. And that's where you're going to be more successful.
Exactly right. I mean, so in the way of the samurai, I think the Tom Cruise movie, there's a bit where he comes out and starts to fight with the wooden sticks, and he keeps losing, and the guy comes over and says, "Too many mind. You need no mind," right? So there's this issue. It's like for years, my studies of martial arts, your teacher tells you. And he's Chinese, right? So he comes from a different culture and he doesn't speak English as a first language. And he uses these certain words to try and describe what you're supposed to do with very, very finely tuned, intricate internal processes to move your body from your dantian and stuff like this, right? And it's almost like trying to describe really when you get down to, when you start to experience what it is you're doing, you then think, I could never describe this. This would be like trying to describe a psychedelic trip to somebody, right? I can't tell them how to give them instructions how to do what I'm doing now, because it's come about from having those instructions, trying to tell my body logically with those verbal instructions what to do, which never works. But then somehow with repetitive action, feeling a feedback, like a neurofeedback, that gives me that interoception that says, hang on. And usually you're guided through pain. because doing it wrong over a while builds a bad habit, which brings about some sort of chronic pain. So you go, I've got to avoid this pain. And then avoiding that pain, if you carry on practicing, brings you to the right action. So there's that letting it go from that logical, rational side that wants, it doesn't matter what you describe with the golfer, getting up and looking at the wind and all that. That's the one that wants all the data. That's the mind that wants all the data but can't let go to the experience, isn't it?
Exactly. Yeah, and I love the way you describe, the Tai Chi, Qigong thing, because I think of meditation as the same way, that it's like there's a felt sense. And I can use words all day and it's not going to do it. Like I can try and kind of point you in the right direction, but it's like, ultimately you got to kind of find it yourself. Yeah. And that's tricky, and it does take a lot of practice and, dedication and awareness, paying attention, and it's possible.
It is. And it's not easy. Like for example, pulling silk, one of the Tai Chi things, you could talk about it. And I think that's why they reduced a lot of these things down to poetry, trying to express it in that kind of condensed Zen-like way,
Yeah.
And obviously the Chinese language as well has this part element that comes from the heart about the emotions as well as the head. So when they communicate with each other, they can talk about these two different places. Whereas with English, the language of merchants, right? We just talk about things, which is very perfect for the materialist paradigm, our language, isn't it? So there's so many things which are really set up in that way to hold us back from these kinds of experiences, it seems. But when you do, and it's an experiential thing, it's a sensing thing. And there's this style in Kung Fu called Xing Yi, and it sort of translates as Xing translates as shape and Yi as intention. And it becomes cyclical because you're intending to get a certain shape to your body. But then after a while, the shape drives the intention and the intention drives the shape. And then you get into this kind of cyclical philosophical state where you're not trying to pursue an end goal anymore. There's this, and I'm told that I've never been a great meditator. So with the African drumming, it's always been like, while I'm doing something that I can get this no mind. But when I sit there and try and get no mind, I've always struggled with that.
Yeah.
I've listened to people who say that when they do get it, they kind of have this interchange between as if they're in the water and out the water. And I kind of get what they're telling me, but I've never experienced it myself.
Yeah.
But it brought me on to John of God. I did a whole bunch of stuff in Brazil with these psychic healers. And one of them was João de Deus, the John of God, who was on Oprah.
Yeah.
And they put the electrodes on him whilst he was doing the healing. And his brainwaves came out at sort of, I don't know what they were, but they were the same as like an African drummer that's in trance, that's in the place, that's hyperactive, but then had this flow state come about.
Interesting. Yeah. And, when what I thought you were going to say, that was a little bit different, but, there have been a couple of people that I've measured their brainwave activity and everything drops out. Everything. Delta, theta, alpha, beta, gamma, everything just like, whoa.
Really?
Yeah. And
well, like technically brain dead or?
Well, I mean, there's still some brainwaves there, but they've all dropped dramatically from their sort of normal waking, consciousness. And I've seen it 3 times. The most recent time was I was studying this channeler who's in Slovenia. She's very well known. And so they brought me out there to do like 3 or 4 days of testing or something. And every time she would channel, so she's talking, but like her brain went just like shut down. And it was like, and this wisdom is just coming out of her. Right. And it's like, okay, like, all right, and so I've seen it there. And I saw it with my biodynamic craniosacral therapy instructor. So when you get into that space where you're holding space for somebody and you just kind of empty out and, you're just allowing. So when he was there, nothing. And then my first Qigong teacher that I was talking about before, now this was a long time ago and I didn't know hardly anything about EEG back then, but I got my first machine. I had no idea what I was doing and I hooked him up when he was meditating. And because I didn't know anything, at that point, I expected everything was alpha. So I thought, oh, when he meditates, it's going to be this huge increase of alpha. And instead, the waves went from jumping up like this to like there was nothing there. And I was so confused at the time. It was only like recently that I was like, oh, I know what he was doing. And he would talk about going to the void. And so it does seem like there's certain people that can just shut it down and just kind of like get their brain completely out of the way.
I was just going to say that. That is literally getting the brain out of the way, isn't it? That is it.
Yeah. I thought that's what you were going to say about John of God, but...
No, it goes the other way, which surprised the hell out of me. That's why I brought it up, because I was expecting that there would be some slowing down, but instead there was a kind of hyper increased activity, but they associate that... excuse me, I remember them saying, we associate that kind of brainwave activity with like an African drummer. They actually use that phrase. So I found that interesting whilst he was in that altered state.
Yeah.
That was what was going on with his brainwaves.
Yes. And it's kind of back to the original point, right? Or one of the original points is that there's a lot of differences, like not everybody gets there the same way,
Right.
So, some people ramp everything way up. Some people shut everything down. With most people, it's a weird mix, like certain things are activated, some things are shutting down, and how they do it, it varies a bit.
But I think that's lovely, you see, because there's always this tension between uniformity and chaos, and we as humans, we seem to reject one extreme or the other, and kind of move with that, with lots of different aspects, So uniformity, everybody one size fits all that we've had in some education systems and this and the other. Medicine, where we make this vaccine, it's going to fit everybody. It doesn't do it, we're all individual. Rick Rubin, the great creative genius who works with musicians and different artists, he says, he's got artists who have the completely opposite creative process to the other. And his skill is able to identify what that person's creative process is and what brings it out of them to get them into whatever state they need to be the creative genius that they are, to bring out their potential. I think that's lovely as this paradigm unfolds, that we're all getting our individuality recognized at the same time as our connectedness. I think that's it's kind of cosmic in the way that's happening. Go on, sorry, carry on.
No, go ahead.
I just wanted to say about like the tests that you're doing with technology and all the rest of it. It just brought up this memory to me about the work that the CIA and all that did with MK Ultra, because obviously they were doing this remote viewing. How much of that stuff were they into with technology stimulating? Do you know? Have you done any research into that?
I've only had kind of remote viewing on the periphery of my work for whatever reason.
Right.
Probably just because that hasn't landed in my lap, right? All these other things have just kind of like shown up for me. And, remote viewing's always been kind of like on the outskirts. So, I know enough about it to understand kind of what the deal is. But I don't know actually if they tried anything like that or not. I wouldn't be surprised. My memory is that they did some kind of audio entrainment kinds of things. I don't know if it was stuff from the Monroe Institute or something like that they were, utilizing. And so, which is actually interesting, because this idea that we can use technology to facilitate some of these things, that's not a new idea.
That's why I bring it up. That's why I bring it up. Because, what you're working on and what you're doing must be on the back of, people that did research. And usually these researchers, some of these things are carried out in a clandestine manner because people don't want that out there for whatever reason, national security. And then they come out later on, and then some of that research gets picked up because files get opened and stuff. So, that part. No, Tom Campbell. That's the other thing that comes to my mind. Are you familiar with his work?
Yeah.
So he was on Rogan recently, and so it picks into this whole issue to me of all the work that you're doing, the work that Diana's doing, the telepathy tapes. A lot of so-called kind of fringe paranormal things are converging into an arena that's getting wider. Kai recently being on Joe Rogan's going to make, going on Joe Rogan is kind of become, the show, isn't it? Once you got Donald Trump goes on there and gets elected, and I'm just waiting. I'm just waiting for the invite. Come on, Joe. You want to know about crop circles, right? Get me on there.
Yeah.
So as that comes on, Tom Campbell talks about, I'm a big fan of the anthropic principle. I like the fact that, there's this particularly John Archibald Wheeler's participatory anthropic principle, and that we're all co-participating. And so this idea of a model of a certain amount of number of people that will have kind of autonomous independence to enable the one mind to gather enough data from all the variables of all of us to then decide the best way of evolving, of going forward. And this foundation of love and compassion that it seems to originate from is the guiding principle. It seems like we're given rope upon which we can hang ourselves.
And we're pretty good at that sometimes.
We are really good at it. And we've gone around this cycle of kind of, empires that have risen and fallen and so on and so on, where we've done unbelievably unspeakable things. Your country set up by my good fellow men, in quite dark ways. And and so, we know a lot more about that now, and we know what we've done to each other. And this aspect of us being recognized. I mean, when Trump was first elected, who was the vice president? What was his name? The guy with the grey hair? Not Vance. No,
no, Vance is.
Yeah, he's the one now, isn't he? That gave Zelensky a telling off the other day. You naughty boy.
Yeah. Why can't I think of his name?
What's his name? Pence. Mike Pence.
Yeah.
Mike Pence. He said, what does he said when he first got elected? I'm a Christian, I'm a something else, and I'm a Republican. He left out, I'm a human.
Maybe he's not.
Well, maybe he's not, right? But I mean, this identity that we have with a religious affiliation, with a political affiliation, with a border or a boundary or a country or a colour or a gender or that part of it seems to need to go as well in terms of the way we hold on to that as humans first. And I think that, so Tom Campbell and his work and us going through an evolution, my question to you is this. Some people believe that those which are so rigid and will not move their mindsets with the awakening that's happening with regards to a world which will be based more on compassion and love and caring and kindness and humans first, rather than a ruthless corporate capitalist system which seems to just benefit the few and so on. And those that have got vested interests in that kind of system and want to maintain it for their own ends and status and whatever, some people think there's going to be a split. Some people think that we're heading towards some kind of divergence in that arena. What do you think about that?
Wow. You say the big ones for the end, huh?
Yeah.
Honestly, I really don't know. I don't know what I think. I mean, things feel, and feeling isn't particularly scientific.
Yeah.
But I feel like things are just ramping up, and I hear that from everybody, right? The intensity is just increasing and increasing and increasing, and it does feel increasingly polarized, right? Like it is this weird split, and I don't know what's going to happen, right? I don't know if there's going to have to be some sort of massive, fallout of that split for things to sort of settle, into some sort of balance of some kind, whatever it is. But like right now, it's really hard to imagine that somehow we're all going to sort of like turn the page and be kumbaya and hold hands and, like that just does not seem very likely.
No.
But yet there are these groups of people who do seem to be elevating their consciousness. And there's things like the telepathy stuff that's coming out now, right? That it's like, and, some of the stuff with the UAPs and, the psionics and things. And, like things are starting to come out that it's like, okay, what's going on? Like it feels like something big is happening.
Yeah.
And where that goes And how it turns out, I have no idea. But, as my dad would say before he passed, like, I just want to stick around long enough to find out how this thing ends. It's like,
amen to that. It's an exciting time, isn't it? I mean, I've gone through the whole depression of like, oh no, we need people to believe. And it's funny how there's a focus on that. My ex-colleague, Michael Glickman, Professor Glickman, is an architect that I worked with, professor of architecture. I worked with on the crop circles quite closely. And we had this conversation once where he used to have these crop circle tea times. People used to come to his house and he'd sit out on this deck outside in his garden. Have all these people that would listen to him talking about, what he'd discovered in the hidden geometry of the crop circle or whatever. And he would notice amongst them the one that was sitting there and sort of tapping his feels and rolling his eyes and thinking, I've been dragged along by his wife, who's brought him on this tour and he didn't want to be there. And he would home in on them. All the other people would be hanging on his every word, but he wanted that guy. He wanted that skeptic to believe as well, And I think we need to, it did us good anyway, in pulling back from that and going, okay, they're on that chapter. No, that's where they are.
Yeah, it's interesting because I've been kind of more and more feeling like, and again, people have been saying this forever, but it's kind of like do your own work, like work on yourself and, get yourself in alignment with your own spirituality and your own values. And like that has its own ripple effect. Like I don't have to try to convince other people to be a certain way and that doesn't work anyway. And it's like, so, more leading by example kind of a thing, it's like, I'm just going to do the best I can in my little world. And hopefully everybody else does the same thing. And, that will have its own effect. And so at least that's where I'm leaning at the moment.
Well, yeah. And I like that. You see, I don't know if it's true. I heard a quote it's supposed to be a quote from Jesus that said, if everybody took care of their own doorstep, then the world would take care of itself, And I think that's it, isn't it? We've got enough work to do internally and we've got friends and supporters that can help us. Sometimes they help us and support us in the way that they necessary, but we get a lesson out of the way we interact with other people anyway. It's a byproduct. Oh no, we're not going to go that way.
Yeah.
But yeah, I find it an exciting time. So what's in the pipeline for you? The documentary with the telepathy tapes, you're involved in that. I'm very excited for I haven't spoken to Kai yet. I hope at some point too.
She's hard to get a hold of right now.
I was going to say there's no point in me trying. She's been on Rogan now, so it's just no.
It's funny because since everything blew up with that, like I can hardly get in touch with her. She's just overloaded with
I'll bet.
So the telepathy tapes that's continuing, and then I'm continuing some additional research that's sort of connected to that. It may not be included in the documentary, but it'll be working with these non-speakers and collecting really airtight data as close as we can get. We're setting up a really sophisticated computerized network so that everything's controlled and separated, and we can do it from different locations, testing people. And so I'm excited about that. We're working on a multi-person heart rate variability biofeedback system. So we could hook up, again, eventually as many people all over the world together at the same time and try to get into a group coherence.
Wow.
So that's exciting.
That's interesting.
Yeah, that's going to take a minute, but it's in process. So, I suspect maybe another 6 months or so.
Okay.
And, doing other work in terms of the stuff we've been talking about of, trying to use technology to see, how can we use this to, help people expand their potential. So those are the big things that I'm working on.
It's a pretty big thing, isn't it? Expanding your potential. It's like, the Esalen Institute, isn't it? It's about the human potential movement. Yeah. This is it. So your book, as I brought up before, when did you actually write that? I didn't notice in the front.
It came out about 1.5 years ago.
Okay, so you got that. And what other websites and links have you got that I can put in the description below that people can follow to get grips of your work? There's the meditation one, which I started watching. I started watching the 6 free courses that you've got that talk about the 4 different types of meditation, focus and the mindfulness and the heart, and the very good explanations of what each one sort of serves to do. What else is there?
Yeah, so that website is neuromeditationinstitute.com. And so that one's all focused on meditative practices and, again, using different approaches and technologies, figuring out which meditation style is best for you, depending on what your needs are, that sort of thing. The other website is psychicmindscience.com. And that one's pretty obvious what it's geared toward.
That's what it says on the label.
It's what it says on the label. And so, we because of some of our earlier conversations, I've had to keep these things a little bit separate from each other. As soon as I started writing that book and became more vocal about it, I got fired from a group that I was working with. Believe it or not, it was a group involved in psychedelic work.
Really?
And this was too far out for them. And they said, since you're no longer interested in science, I'm like, okay.
Excellent.
Anyway, so, I've got them sort of separate.
Okay.
But those are the 2 ways to find me.
Okay, great. Thanks. Well, I'll put links for that down in the description below.
Thanks.
Jeff, this has been a fantastic conversation. Thanks so much for joining me.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Oh, that's absolutely great. Thanks very much.